Well, it's a real pleasure for me to introduce this morning's speaker, Greg Sterling, who will give the fourth annual Abraham J. Malherbe Plenary Address and the concluding address of the conference. Greg currently serves as the Reverend Henry L. Slack, Dean of Yale Divinity School, a position he's held since 2012, and in which he was recently renewed for a second 5-year term, strong vote of confidence. Along with his administrative responsibilities, he also serves as the Lillian Klaus Professor of New Testament at YDS and as Professor of Religion in the Department of Religious Studies at Yale. These two named titles are symbolically significant. They attest to the rare blend of creative and clearly successful administrative leadership and sustained scholarly inquiry that have typified Greg's professional career. He's pursued these twin, and for him, interlocking rather than competing interests at two universities, the University of Notre Dame, 1989 to 2012, and Yale University, 2012 to the present. At Notre Dame, as David mentioned, he served as Dean of the Graduate School from 2008 to 2012. And as we all know, that's an extraordinarily important position in any university. It was a capstone appointment preceded by a string of decanal and administrative roles beginning in 1993, when in the third year of his first appointment, he served as acting director of the MA program in the Department of Theology. His 5 years at Yale Divinity School, easily one of the most highly visible and influential leadership positions in theological education in North America, if not the world, have been characterized by strong fiscal management, a series of head-turning appointments, faculty appointments, entrepreneurial collaboration with other theological institutions, bold visionary planning that envisions, among other things, a $100 million environmentally friendly campus expansion plan, providing below-market housing for students. And I'm sure Greg would welcome any $25 million matching gift that any of you would like to participate in. You can talk with him after the lecture. Doing all this while keeping Yale's enrollments strong in all of its degree programs within a national environment of shrinking pools of applicants. That's a stunning set of administrative achievements. But no less important is the arc of scholarly productivity that began in the early 1990s. Most notably with his published dissertation, Historiography and Self-Definition, Josephus, Luke Acts, and Apologetic Historiography, published by Brill in 1992, paperback reprint edition, SBL 2006. Among the scores of monographs devoted to Luke Acts over the last 30 years, this is undoubtedly one of the most seminal and influential. For one thing, it introduced apologetic historiography as a category for getting at the tangled question of the literary genre of Acts. For another, it not only advanced the conversation between Luke Acts scholarship and Josephine scholarship, but it also broadened the historiographical framework by including other Hellenistic Jewish voices, Artapanos, Eupolemus, all of these friends of mine. Historiography and Self-Definition was and remains a work of daunting erudition, still referential for any serious student of Luke Acts. Many scholars would be happy with that publication alone, to their credit. Greg's earliest published article in a referee journal, Philo's Questiones Prolegomena, or Afterthought, published in 1991, also signaled one of his major research interests, Philo of Alexandria. The title of his 2003 article Philo has not been used half enough. The significance of Philo of Alexandria for the study of the New Testament explains Greg's unremitting pursuit of this elusive Alexandrian, who has fascinated biblical scholars and historians of ancient Mediterranean religion over the past, at least since the early 1800s. But even so, Philonic studies has undergone a revival of interest over the last few decades, and Greg has been one of the major leaders of this Philonic renaissance. Apart from scores of scholarly articles on Philo, Greg has co-edited with his close friend David Runia 19 volumes of the Studia Philonica Journal, 1997 to 2016. He also serves as the editor of the Philo of Alexandria commentary series, 4 volumes of which have already appeared, and when complete, will constitute an invaluable resource for Philonic studies. Greg has also agreed to write 2 of the projected volumes, one on Philo's Hypothetica and another on De Vita Moses, the life of Moses. While Greg's scholarly interests have ranged widely within the broad field of Hellenistic Judaism, he's also written numerous articles on the New Testament. Typical of his capacity to spot literary patterns is his 2001 Harvard Theological Review article, Moore's Philosophy, The Death of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, in which he insightfully compared Luke's account of the death of Jesus with that of Socrates. This article is required reading in my course on the Gospel of Luke, an exemplary piece of creative exegesis that relates a New Testament text to Greek philosophical traditions. It's also welcome news that Greg has contracted to write the commentary on Ephesians in the Hermeneia series, the standard critical commentary series in English on the New Testament. Also forthcoming are 2 monographs, Constructing the Present from the Past, The Creation of Christian Identity from a Jewish historiographical tradition, Erdman's, and The Jewish Plato, Philo of Alexandria, Greek-speaking Judaism, and Christian Origins. Combined with these 2 strands of his work, the administrative and scholarly, as David mentioned, is Greg's instinctive ecclesial perspective. A true child of the Stone Campbell tradition, Greg has served as the minister of the Churches of Christ in various stages of his career. Also true to this tradition, he's operated with a genuine ecumenical spirit, seen, for example, in his steady commitment over the years to the Catholic Biblical Society and its journal, Catholic Biblical Studies, but also in his palpable commitments to Jewish institutions and scholarly colleagues, for example, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem Institute for Advanced Studies. As we all know, A. Malherbe stood for and exemplified a stratospheric set of scholarly standards. And no one embodies those standards today better than Greg Sterling. So Greg, we look forward to hearing your remarks this morning. Thank you.
Well, after that, it's going to be all downhill. It is a true honor to be with you. Thank you, Carl, for such a gracious and overly generous introduction. At this conference, we had a tradition. On Wednesday evenings, the Malherbes, the Holidays, and the Sterlings had dinner together. It was an evening that we looked forward to and enjoyed. Probably Carl and Abe and I more than our spouses. If you just know the personalities of the people involved, you can understand why I say that. But it was a remarkable event, and it's nice because I was fortunate to introduce Carl when this lectureship was inaugurated, and now we have reversed that, and he has introduced me. David, thank you very much. David asked me to talk about institutions of higher education within Churches of Christ. So that's what I'm going to do. Perhaps the most famous statement of a pre-Socratic philosopher is the observation that Heraclitus made about constant change in the cosmos. Plato reported, Heraclitus says that everything is in motion. Nothing stands still. He compares the universe to the flow of a river, saying that you cannot enter the same river twice. We frequently apply this aphorism to the change within human culture. When we do so, we often think of a wide, smooth-flowing river. But what if we think of a torrent of white water in a stream or a river? I want to suggest to you that the rush of such a river is a more apt frame in which to conceive of the rate of change in the 21st century than that wide, smooth-flowing river. This is certainly true of the changes taking place within Christianity. If we think globally, we can see the shifts on a massive scale. Christians comprise 31% of the world's population. Muslims, 24%. Unaffiliated individuals, 16%. Hindus, 15%. And Buddhists, 7%. Other major religions constitute much smaller portions of the world's population. But perhaps more important than the numbers is the shifts, the geographical shifts that are taking place within Christianity. The center of Christendom is moving south and east. For example, in 1910, 66% of the world's Christians lived in Europe. In 2010, 26%. In 1910, only 1.4% of the world's Christians lived in sub-Saharan Africa. In 2010, this percentage had grown to 23.6%. It is estimated that by 2060, 42% of the world's Christians will live in sub-Saharan Africa. Perhaps even more startling is that given the fertility rate of Muslims, it is expected that they will be roughly equal in size to Christians in terms of the world's population. There are similar changes taking place in the United States. We are all concerned about the decline of Christianity. From 2007 to 2014, a period of only 7 years, the number of Americans who self-identified as Christians dropped from 78.4% to 70.6%. Mainline Protestants, the Seven Sisters, dropped the most at 3.4%. Catholics were not far behind at 3.1%, while evangelicals lost less than 1%. Two groups grew. Non-Christian faiths increased moderately, but the big story was with the unaffiliated, who expanded exponentially at 6.7% in that short time period. It isn't hard to see where former Christians are going. We like to say they haven't lost their spirituality, but they have lost their religion or their commitment to organized religion. If we ask more specifically about Churches of Christ, we find in this same time period a relatively stable picture. According to the Pew Research Center, Churches of Christ, and here I'm pretty sure this also includes independent Christian churches, these numbers, held steady. If we look specifically at the a cappella Churches of Christ, the latest numbers I found were in roughly 1.2 million individuals who are actively involved in Churches of Christ today. If you think back to about 1990, that number was more like 1.7 million. So we are struggling with the same phenomenon as others. When you think about this in terms of colleges and universities, you have to think of generations. And as you think of generations, you'll see that there is a spread of generations. The majority of people attending Churches of Christ are in the baby boomer and Generation X generations, which might cause us some concern. However, if you look at this across generations, and I'm sorry, I had no idea when I prepared these slides what the screens would be like, so these are a little small, and I realize that, so I'll try to tell you what you're looking at. But the spread of participants across generations is relatively healthy. The younger millennials and the silent generation have the same percentage at 15%. And if you think of generations more broadly, there are approximately the same percentage of millennials, 27%, Generation X, 25%, and baby boomers at 31%. However, if you think about Churches of Christ in terms of education, it's somewhat disappointing because only 11% have a college degree. I was really surprised when I saw that number. And that's not doing very well compared to many of our peers. All of this is my way of saying this is how quickly the water is flowing, and it presents the complexities that those who try to administrate within schools and colleges affiliated with Churches of Christ have to think about the landscape. And as a dean of a divinity school, it's the same kind of landscape I worry about in a very broad context. I'm not going to pretend to answer how we should address all of these changes, but I do want to make a case. I want to make a case as someone who spent his life in Churches of Christ and is still in Churches of Christ, because I believe that our ideals, the ideas upon which the tradition was launched, offer a distinctive and potentially effective way of positioning our schools and mutatis mutandis churches in our society. I'm going to make the case first by just giving you an idea of the complexity of the landscape of higher education, and then we will take a look at what it means to think about Christian identity within the context of the 21st century. So we begin by considering the need for a distinctive identity. When historians reflect back on the contributions that the United States of America made to the world in the 20th century, one of the greatest contributions will be American higher education. And I don't say that simply because I'm a part of that, but because this system has influenced people internationally in ways that go well beyond what most people recognize. A particular feature of our system is its diversity. There are 4,664 accredited degree-granting colleges and universities in the U.S. In order to study these institutions, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching developed a system of classification in 1970 that groups comparable institutions into categories. The Carnegie Foundation published 7 separate studies before transferring this project to the Center for Post-Secondary Research at Indiana University School of Education in 2014. That center released its first study the following year. The 2015 analysis applied 32 classifications to schools that can be summarized in 8 broad categories. The subcategories, this worked better when we didn't have people in the room, but the subcategories have to do in some way simply with size. So for the master's colleges, they are lumped into larger programs, medium-sized programs, and small programs, just for example. But the sheer number of institutions and the range of their nature suggest that institutions need to develop distinctive identities to distinguish themselves. They must also take into consideration the specific functions of institutions within their category. For example, the two types of institutions that serve the largest number of students are doctoral universities and associate colleges. Each serves almost 1/3 of all students. However, the size of these institutions and their functions are very different. Research universities, doctoral institutions, comprise only 7% of the total number of institutions, while associate colleges constitute almost 1/4 of all the institutions. Doctoral institutions typically are larger. They also have different emphases. Doctoral institutions are the research engine of our country. Associate colleges are almost entirely devoted to teaching and often emphasize applied skills. The point is, one size doesn't fit all, and you have to take into account where you're at when you think about your own identity. What about schools affiliated with Churches of Christ? There are 18 such institutions. 8 belong to the master's colleges and universities category, 6 to the baccalaureate or baccalaureate associate category, 2 to the doctoral category. Congratulations to Lipscomb for joining the rank. And 2 to the special focus 4-year category. In addition to these 18 institutions, we should mention that independent Christian churches have 19 institutions affiliated with them. If we were to hazard a generalization about all of these institutions, we could say that the majority of schools affiliated with Churches of Christ and independent Christian churches are focused on bachelor and master's programs. And that would be true even for the 2 that are classified as doctoral institutions in terms of their bread and butter. This means that the 18 colleges and universities, plus the 19 in the independent Christian churches, those 37 are part of the 1,732 institutions that compete for roughly 1/3 or 6,500,000 of the 20,500,000 students in the U.S. How do you distinguish yourself? It is not enough to simply claim that you're a Christian institution. I don't know how many of the 4,664 make that claim, but a significant number. That's safe to say. But what I do know is this, that making that claim is no guarantee that you will survive. In the last 8 years, 11% of the schools affiliated with Christian churches and Churches of Christ have ceased to exist. 4 in particular, and they're listed here for you. Institutions must be able to articulate a distinctive identity amid the clamor of voices for the attention of students. In large universities, it is even necessary for individual schools to fashion a distinct identity. So we try to give the Divinity School at Yale a distinct identity within Yale University. We have our own sense of identity. But this also leads me to recast the issue in terms of mission. If I may paraphrase Mark 2:27, colleges and universities exist to serve humanity and the world. Humanity does not exist to serve colleges and universities. I once heard Steve Sample, the former and very distinguished president of the University of Southern California, say, "Universities exist to meet the needs of the contemporary world." I could not agree more. When we think about mission, we need to remember that we do not simply work for the benefit of our institutions, whether they are colleges or universities or churches. We work for the benefit of the people they serve. Students need to remember this. Schools don't exist for the sake of students. Schools exist for the sake of the student or the people those students will serve. Students are the agents through which the schools attempt to influence and change society. Now, I don't mean by this that mission is identical with identity, but to argue they're related. Identity should inform mission, and mission should reinforce identity. That then leads to the key question. How do we form a Christian identity? When I was at the University of Notre Dame, we devoted enormous energy to the Catholic identity of the university. And anybody who's wrestled with these things in institutions know the issues are not simple. It involves representation through personnel, although this can't simply be quantitative. The most counterproductive faculty hire was a disaffected Catholic. There were a number of non-Catholics who were far more supportive of the mission of the university. One of them was here at this conference, George Marsden, who was far more important to the mission of the university than a number of his Catholic colleagues. There are other factors as well. Masses opened and closed the academic year. Priests lived in dormitories. The curriculum was shaped to reflect Catholic values. The university sponsored a large number of events that promoted values associated with Catholicism. And the iconography of the university was carefully considered. Every classroom had a crucifix. In all of those ways, people took this very seriously. So what should we do within churches of Christ? I want to suggest that the two principles on which our movement was built have the potential to offer a distinctive identity that can be quite effective in the 21st century. The two principles are unity or ecumenism, and sola scriptura, and restoration. But I'm going to reformulate them from their traditional formulation. So I'd like to consider the origins, the limits, and the possibilities of each. We start with unity or ecumenism. While many in churches of Christ forgot that we began as a unity movement, unity or ecumenism is at the heart of our origins. In his Memoirs of Alexander Campbell, Robert Richardson related a pivotal incident in Campbell's career prior to coming to America. He was a student at the University of Glasgow, you see. Since he was a member of the Succession Presbyterian Church in Ireland and didn't have a letter from that church to carry to Scotland, he had to go before the elders of the Anterburger Successor Presbyterian Church in Glasgow to obtain a token to be able to participate in the semi-annual communion service. Some of you know this story well. Campbell had misgivings about the exclusive nature of that communion service. And after struggling with his decision, he dropped the lead token onto the plate and refused to participate. Writing almost 60 years later, Richardson dramatically commented, "The ring of the token falling upon the plate announced the instant at which he had renounced Presbyterianism forever. The leaden voucher becoming thus a token not of communion, but of separation." While Campbell vacillated on the issue of open communion as a result of his understanding of baptism, the movement has not. Isaac Garrett may have provided the best formulation of what became the traditional practice. Our practice, therefore, is neither to invite nor reject particular classes of persons, but to spread the table in the name of the Lord for the Lord's people and allow all to come who will, each on their own responsibility. Out of that judgment came the refrain, We neither invite nor debar, which characterizes the practice. The non-committal character of the invitation has made different interpretations possible, but at the same time, it unambiguously points to our origins as a unity or ecumenical movement. And it's that point that I think offers possibilities today. The original vision was that all denominational structures would fade into oblivion as Christians from all traditions united. As the address that accompanied the last will and testament of the Springfield Presbytery put it, we heartily unite with all our Christian brethren of every name in thanksgiving to God for the display of his goodness in the glorious work he is carrying on in our Western country, which we hope will terminate in the universal spread of the gospel and unity of the church. Unfortunately, the movement that began as a unity movement ossified into its own sect. If you want to be honest, Churches of Christ is a sectarian response, and denomination, the Disciples of Christ. Should we simply write off the vision as another failed experiment in Protestant Christianity? I think not. I think that we need to rethink what it means to advocate unity. Why? There's a deep distrust of institutions in our society. We recognize this in the political arena. I was at Oxford the week of the Brexit vote, where all of my colleagues were shocked. We went through a rather surprising election in this country last fall. I was in Germany this spring when the French voted, and even though the populists didn't win the vote, they still carried 36% of the popular vote. One of the animating forces that has driven these populist movements is the deep distrust many people, especially the younger generation, have of institutions, and it's hard to blame them. In one night, September 15, 2008, to be quite specific, nearly every major financial institution that I had known my entire life almost went out of existence and almost brought down the U.S. economy with them. Why? It's widely recognized that the 2008 financial crisis was caused by human greed, led by those running our financial industry. Now, I wish I could say that Christians are an exception to the moral crises that have led to the suspicion of institutions, but all of us know that's not true. The investigations of the Boston Globe in 2002, dramatized in Tom McCarthy's 2015 film Spotlight, have made it all too clear that even those in the highest positions of ecclesial trust were unreliable. They placed the institution before the children who were the victims. And while the Roman Catholic Church received the greatest publicity, they were not the only ones struggling with this. The scandals of the televangelists' moral meltdowns were just as embarrassing to all of us. The result was the erosion of confidence in all ministers, Protestant, Catholic, and non-Christian. I remember Monk Malloy, who's the president of the University of Notre Dame, telling this story. He had gone to Florida for an event, and while he was there, a young child saw him, and their face lit up, and they began running towards Monk, who's really a fine man. And Monk bent down to welcome this child, and the child's mother, with an anguished look on her face, swooped in, grabbed the child, and took the child off. And as I heard Monk tell the story, I was thinking, what have we come to? Where are we as a society? This is but one factor that has led to the diminution of major denominations. Mainline Protestant denominations have lost half of their membership since the 1960s. Half. They all have twice as many divinity schools and seminaries as they need. It's created huge challenges for them. Nor has the bleeding ended. 8 of the 15 largest Protestant denominations lost members from 2007 to 2014. 5 held their own, including Churches of Christ, and I'm just, sociologically, there's no denying we are a denomination, so I'm just going to use that, be honest about it. Only 2 grew. During the first year that I served as dean of Yale Divinity School, I visited an alum who'd been the president of a major research university and a U.S. ambassador. When I asked him about the need to serve mainline denominations, he responded, I'm quoting, this is somebody who's a lifelong and devout member of a mainline Protestant church. Do not tie the future of the school to the main lines. They are sinking ships. Last week, I had lunch with a very distinguished individual who's a member of another major mainline church, had a 50-year career in a major research university. When I asked him about the history of a particular mainline, he concluded, quote, I think that denominations will cease to exist by the end of this century. They have served their purpose and have made contributions, but their time is coming to an end. You may or may not agree with them, but just think about this. When people move from one community to another, who actually go to church and want to go to church, what do they look for? It's not necessarily a church with the same name. It's a church that is vibrant, that serves the needs of their family. That introduces an important corollary. One of the most important criticisms of churches today is that churches care more about what they believe than about the people they serve. So in addition to the nuns, we now have the duns. These are people who've had ties to churches and have walked away and said, I'm done. They have been hurt, or they've witnessed too many political fights within the church. The common criticisms are that Christians are narrow-minded, judgmental, and hypocritical. And while none of those accusations or criticisms are new, they have become more common and carried greater force. Now, there's one aspect of this that concerns me, and that is those who advocate that we should identify with the evangelical world. This wasn't an option until the 1990s, at least it was never considered an option when I was growing up. And while I can appreciate aspects of the evangelical world, this is not a panacea, and personally, I'm not going to make that move. Let me illustrate. I could give many illustrations. I'm going to tell one story to illustrate it. I was once invited to speak on the inspiration of Scripture at a very conservative evangelical school. I was invited as a New Testament scholar. The president of another conservative evangelical university was also to speak. He spoke first, and never once, in about a 45-minute address, cited Scripture. Not one time. All he cited were evangelical theologians who commented about Scripture. My entire presentation was just a series of biblical examples that I walked people through. And I sat there and wondered, who has the higher view of Scripture? Somebody who only talks about it, or somebody who actually reads it and worries about what it means? Now, there are certainly many evangelical scholars who would have approached this question differently, and I don't want to generalize and be simplistic. But there's a frame of reference that precludes what Scripture can and cannot say, and I, for one, will never buy that. That is counter to our tradition. You read the text, and you have to read it honestly, and you go where the evidence leads you. And anything short of that, to me, is unacceptable. Why do we feel the need to identify with others? I would like to see a return to the plea for unity, not a unity of denominations as the modern ecumenical movement has advocated, and not a plea for non-denominational Christianity as we have articulated in very sectarian terms, but a unity without denominational boundaries, recast in the light of the changed realities of Christianity in modern society. We have an ideal. We should not give it up. This immediately leads to the second presupposition of the Restoration movement, sola scriptura, and the accompanying plea for restoration. The means by which unity was to be achieved was by relying on Scripture and only on Scripture. This standard Protestant value was combined with an epistemology drawn from Scottish common sense realism. While the more famous thinkers of Francis Bacon and John Locke names are associated with this, probably for the movement, the key figure was Thomas Reid, who argued that the antidote to skepticism was common sense. Not common sense of a opinio communis, that is what we all believe in general, but common sense as the principles of human reasoning and belief formation. In the formulation of George Davy, we are to respect the instincts of the farmer as against the sophistication of the philosopher, end of quote. In the history of the Restoration movement, it led to the view that every Christian should read Scripture for herself or himself and live according to their understanding, a principle that I have cherished and still cherish. However, it assumed that we would all, if we all used the same reasoning skills, we would reach the same basic conclusions. That didn't work so well. This epistemology and hermeneutic had enormous appeal to the popular democratizing movements of the 19th century. For many years, individuals within churches of Christ were known for their reading and knowledge of Scripture. I once was approached, somebody knocked on my door, and from a different group, I'll let you imagine which group. And I went back and they wanted to talk about the Bible. I went back, got my Greek Testament, went to the door, and they said, "No, we're reading from this translation. What translation are you reading from?" And I said, "Well, actually, it's not a translation. It's just a Greek Testament." And they looked at me and said, "You must be from Churches of Christ." And I said, "Thank you. You have made my month." We used to really know the text. However, as one Robert Zimmerman, a.k.a. Bob Dylan, has reminded us, the times they are a-changing. Today, only about 60% of the members of Churches of Christ read their Bibles on a weekly basis, a percentage that places us well below many conservative Christian traditions. Scripture simply doesn't have the place that it once had. But we've also come to realize that Scottish common sense realism cannot serve as an adequate foundation for an epistemology. Even if we question the dethronement of reason that is part of the postmodern world, our own history is a record of the failure of the principle. There are at least 8 major branches within our tradition. We have not read the Scripture in the same way. Common people reading a common text is not a guarantee of unanimity. Should we then abandon sola scriptura? I would argue no, we should not. However, we need to rethink our presuppositions about how we approach it. As appealing as the claim might be that we should listen to a farmer rather than a philosopher, it hasn't worked. While Campbell, to his credit, recognized that Scripture was an ancient literature and should be read as such, he didn't appreciate the full gap that existed between the ancient text and the modern world. I'm going to give you a visual image and then two illustrations. So I used to think about this when I lived in Jerusalem. If I can get the slide there. Oftentimes on Saturday afternoons, I used to walk along the ridge, which is the watershed of Israel, the top of the Mount of Olives. I lived on French Hill. Mount Scopus is where the Hebrew University is. And I'd walk along that ridge, and from the top of that ridge, some of you have done this, you can look over and you can see Jordan. Not only the Dead Sea, but the country Jordan, not that far away. But I realized that the distance between where I was standing in Israel, in a largely Jewish world, across to that Arab country was enormous. There were, as Anthony Thistleton said, two horizons. So what does that have to do with the biblical text? Several years ago, I was asked to translate a series of texts from Philo of Alexandria. One of these was an astronomical text. And as I started trying to translate this text, I began to ask myself, well, how would someone who lived prior to Copernicus, prior to Newton, and prior to Einstein have thought about the starry skies? I look at these starry skies and I have a completely different preconception of what I'm looking at than what Philo of Alexandria would have had. Now think about that with respect to the New Testament. When I read Paul's descriptions of a human being, I'm reading somebody's descriptions who knows nothing about modern genetics, nothing about neurology, nothing about psychology. When we think of ourselves, these are things that are simply part of the way that we conceive of ourselves. We're not even conscious that we're thinking that way most of the time. So how do we appreciate that difference? To the credit of administrators and professors and supporters of colleges and universities affiliated with Churches of Christ, this has been realized. And here I mean this in a very genuine way. In an era when many divinity schools and seminaries are trying to shorten and collapse preparation for ministers, Churches of Christ have schools affiliated with Churches of Christ have initiated more schools of theology than I think any other single tradition. We're in one right now. And I salute the people that have had this vision. It is a realization that Scottish common sense realism doesn't work. People need to be trained to read an ancient text. There's another issue. What distinguished our use of sola scriptura from most other Protestants was the claim that we could reconstruct and then restore the New Testament church. This hermeneutic assumed that we could gather all of the evidence within the New Testament and discern the model of the church that would be a template for the church today. The assumption is that the New Testament is a single harmonious text. And the problem with that assumption is it doesn't work. It is not a single harmonious text. The differences among the Gospels are real. If you read the Synoptic Gospels vertically, they'll strike you as being very similar. That is, read Matthew and then read Mark. When you read Mark, you say, well, I already read this in a longer form. But put them side by side and look at the same story carefully, and you'll find out just how different they are. When you read Paul, you will discover there are lines of development. Nor are these lines of development only in areas like eschatology. They also deal with ecclesiology. Does anyone really believe that Christianity in Jerusalem was the same as Christianity in Corinth? Or that Christianity in Corinth was structured in the same way that Christianity in the pastoral epistles is being governed? We need to realize that the New Testament itself is a rich and diverse collection of texts. A collection that does not answer to the assumption that if we just use our minds, we will all come to the same perception of this text. We will differ, and that's hardly a surprise, because the New Testament itself has differences. The claim for restoration can no longer be a claim to restore a single model of the church, but an argument that diversity is constitutive of Christianity. I've only sketched an answer to an incredibly challenging question. And in reality, I would say that all I've done is given a few hints. I haven't really sketched anything all that fully. We need to find ways to define ourselves, our colleges and our universities distinctively, or we'll be part of those that simply pass by the way. To do so, we must stand for something. I hope that we will never be ashamed to call ourselves Christians or to call these colleges and universities Christian institutions. If we feel ashamed of that, we've thrown in the towel as far as I'm concerned. At the same time, we cannot afford to make that claim in a narrow way. Nor can we simply work to promote institutions over people. I'm personally not ready to surrender the ideals that gave birth to our movement. I believe that we need to rethink them and redefine them. The mistrust of institutions that is pulsing through so many, the beginning of the collapse of denominationalism, invites us to rethink unity again. We need to be honest about the failures of our own movement and our own current standing as a denomination. We also need to continue to emphasize Scripture, but to realize that the unity of Christianity does not depend upon the unity of belief. I don't mean that there aren't any limits. I do believe there are limits. But we should recognize that the New Testament itself contains a wide range of views. And above all, we need to remember that the call to follow Jesus is a call to serve others, not institutions. Institutions are only the means, not the end. The end is serving humanity ad gloriam Dei. Thank you.
two stories. Several years ago, I think it was in the early 1980s, I'd moved to Emory and I got a call from Abe, and we were talking about something, and he said, I've been in touch with somebody from California, and he probably said, some kid from California, and said his name is Greg Sterling, and he's been writing me about graduate school, and he talked for a while, and he said, keep your eye on him. He's good. And as we all know from Abe, Abe wasn't given to the use of superlatives. And if you could ever extract a good from Abe, that was very good. And Abe was also a good prophet. And so telling that story that connects Greg with Abe sort of reminds me of Polycarp reminiscing about seeing the Apostle John establishing those links. Second story, several years ago, Greg and I were in Jerusalem at the Institute for Advanced Study at the Hebrew University, and we had a conference, and we'd spent a year there. And the conference ended on Friday afternoon. It was Shabbat, and so Greg and David Runya and I sort of said, well, what are we going to do? And somebody said, well, let's go to Mount Sinai. And have you been to Mount Sinai? No, I haven't been to Mount Sinai. Well, David has a car, so let's go to Mount Sinai. In those days, you could drive from Jerusalem to the Sinai Peninsula. And so we got in the car and drove to Mount Sinai, and we got a guide and decided to climb Mount Sinai. So it was David and Mr. Greg and I. We got an Arab guide, and so we, started ascending Mount Sinai, and it is a spectacular vision. I mean, when you're there and the sunset, it's just amazing. So we'd stop and rest, and about 2/3 of the way up, we stopped and rested, and the guide started sort of joking about these overweight people. They don't have energy and they can't climb Mount Sinai. And Greg said, you want to race? And so he took his coat off and gave it to me, and gave his camera to David and said, let's go. And so Greg raced to the top of Mount Sinai and left this poor guy sort of dangling in the dust. And so racing to the top as an image for our friend Greg Sterling. Just let that image register for a while.